In a fast-paced tech environment, the potential attack surface increases with each release and new app created. Detectify automates cutting-edge knowledge from trusted ethical hackers into the development pipeline for reliable application security. Go beyond the OWASP Top 10. Check your web apps for over 2,000 known vulnerabilities actively exploited in the wild, monitor subdomains for potential takeovers, and remediate security issues in staging and production. Learn more with a free trial at securityweekly.com/detectify. Go hack yourself. By connecting to your code repository, AccuRx generates a topology across your full stack to reveal risks so that you can harden your architecture. It also scans code for violations against compliance and security standards to enforce best practices. In addition, AccuRx develops threat models using vulnerability feeds, IAM privileges, and other data to predict potential breach paths. Learn how easy it is to get started with AccuRx at securityweekly.com/AccuRx. Application security is hard when security is separated from your DevOps workflow. Security has traditionally been the final hurdle in the development lifecycle. Iterative development workflows can make security a release bottleneck. With GitLab, security is built into the CI/CD process. Every code commit is automatically scanned for security vulnerabilities in your code and its dependencies. Results are delivered to the developer in their native workflow for rapid remediation. Learn how GitLab enables DevSecOps. Visit securityweekly.com/GitLab for a 30-day free trial.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by Matt Alderman and John Kinsella. Would you like to have all of your favorite Security Weekly content at your fingertips? Do you want to hear from Sam and Andrea when we have upcoming webcasts and technical trainings? Have a question for one of our illustrious hosts, someone from the Security Weekly team, or wish you could hang with the Security Weekly crew and community? Subscribe on your favorite podcast catcher, sign up for the mailing list, and join our Discord server to stay in the loop on all things Security Weekly. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe. In our October 22nd technical training, we will provide a first look at a new free resource that delivers thousands of remedies as a service to bridge the gap between vulnerabilities found and vulnerabilities fixed. On October 28th, learn how to build an integrated security platform in our webcast at 3 p.m. Eastern. Visit securityweekly.com/webcast to see what we have coming up, or visit securityweekly.com/on-demand to view our previously recorded webcasts. And this brings us to the news of the week, which I was very, very, very happy to see how on theme everything was for Halloween, especially since we can party like it's almost 1999, because we have a ping of death. John, I think you perked up for this one. Want to introduce this to us?
I don't know if I'd say perked up. Yeah, you can tell from the chuckles.
Fell down, dying.
Yeah, it's so. I think this has probably got a lot of attention by now. Our buddies up here in Redmond have another network stack issue, this time in IPv6 ICMP. So I saw the headline and started looking at it and swore a little bit. And my comment, as I said before, about how do you spend $1 billion a year on InfoSec and still have buffer overflows in your ICMP stack? But Matt, I think Mike, you went into a little bit deeper and actually looked at some of the details around this. I stopped when I got that far, and I'm like,
we actually covered part of this on ASW last week. And look, apply the patch. I did it right before the show. It took almost an hour for the stupid thing to reboot and get back to normal. Okay, so I made it. So first piece. And the workaround is crazy, because we were talking about this last week. They're like, yeah, just basically turn off IPv6 in Windows. Do you know how much stuff in the new Microsoft Azure stack in O365 is dependent on IPv6? You can't just turn it off.
So, and that's where it is, I guess, two things. One, it is nice to see that people perhaps are even using IPv6. So, that's one of those long time comings when we can measure, protocols in decades that we've been waiting for universal adoption.
That's probably why it took
yes.
That's probably why it took so long just to find us.
That's right. Needed somebody to use it. But I will say, to John's point, I want to sort of go through the thought exercise. We'll hear thought experiment that if this were back in the 1996, 97, when we first heard about a large packet attacks, basically the original ping of death, that this kind of stack overflow could have been much worse. So, for example, so far it's only identified to be a DOS, which can be pretty painful depending on what Windows-based system is getting DOS, especially if it's your AD service. But this wasn't trivially turned into an RCE, and I think that is a little bit thankful to, and fingers crossed I'm going to be proven right here over the next couple of weeks, is that stack integrity. We're talking just in the previous section with Taylor about control flow analysis. There's also control flow integrity. So hopefully a lot of the stack guards, a lot of the capabilities that Microsoft has been spending their time on to recompile a lot of this code with such things, is that has protected us from being worse. So I guess I'll go through that, not to say that necessarily, well, yes, it could be better, but I'll just take that viewpoint of it could have been a lot worse.
I just got an idea. Remember that toy we were talking about last week that might end up with people going to the ER because parts of their body were caught in it? Imagine if that was running Windows 10 IoT Core. No? Nobody? So if anyone out there in the audience hears of sex toys that are being powered by Windows, tell us about it.
There are researchers focused on this area, so hopefully, yes, we in this episode we're going to get into some more hardware. But before we do, yes, let's find out where all the other places that IPv6 is, and we're also going to go into, speaking of, here's a segue. Speaking of full disclosure, John, you are watching that mailing list quite a bit, and you came across a bit of an interesting one that stood out for you, I think.
I did. I did a few actually. Let's see. So we had the SIM one.
SIM and Container D, I believe, or both of those.
Yeah, we had
the SIM.
Two of them. So I'll start with the SIM one, QRadar, competitor of mine from many, many years ago. Glad to see they're still alive and out there and part of IBM. Yeah, and this is again, one of our themes from last week. We were talking about security tools with security vulnerabilities in them, and here's another. So QRadar, for those who don't know, is another SIM product out there like ArcSight or I guess Splunk, depending on how you think about it. But one thing's actually the first thing I want to talk about is what I just did is describe what this tool is. So as I was looking at this, one of the things we see in security vulnerabilities out there are in vulnerability disclosures or announcements. Frequently, they'll just say, hey, QRadar had a buffer overflow or a parsing issue with this one thing, and we've patched it, and you need to upgrade to this version. Well, what was that thing? Is it running in my environment? Do I need to Google it? What's the right version of it? What is this? So I'm a big fan of disclosures that actually have a little, few sentences up top that say, this is what this thing is. So props to these guys for doing this. But really what's going on here is an authenticated user can call one of the vulnerable methods and cause a servlet. So this is actually a client-side issue in the SIM client in a browser, I believe. Servlet, so our buddy Java. But basically there was a way to to get the server to deserialize arbitrary objects which you'd be pushing back across the wire. And then that would give you the ability to do things that you shouldn't be doing on the SIM server side of things. So interesting. I don't think we've seen too many of these deserialization from the Java school of things for the last 6 or 12 months, or at least are not in my memory right now. So it's interesting to see that type of issue still around as we still use some of those older languages.
Yeah, that's what the things that stood out for me too, is that we saw 3 or 4 years ago, I want to say, the Java deserialization was absolutely in vogue, hopped on to the OWASP top 10 updated list for the year, and haven't seen too much. So it was nice to see this and that little combination of JSON as well as to Java type of deserialization attack. Also, a tie into the authentication broad topic we were talking about in the first session last week was this other Container D vulnerability. And don't know if there's anything particular you wanted to note about this, John.
Yeah, I meant to do a little more research on this one over the weekend, so maybe folks can chime in as they know here at Discord or YouTube or wherever. So specific version Container D 1.2x. Container Ds have had for a while the ability. So let's break it down here. So Container D runs your containers on a server. People think Docker, but this is one of the pieces underneath the hood. A Docker image is made up of something called a manifest. So that basically says these are the layers in your Docker image, and the Docker image is or a running container is usually a hierarchical file system. So you want to pull down an image and actually go and run it. So layer by layer, you want to be able to actually go and get the layers and download them one at a time. This saves you from having to download a big old thing every time if just one part of that image changes. But one of the specs in there as part of that manifest is you're able to actually specify not just the image or the layer SHA to download, but also, hey, why don't you go ahead and get it from this particular server over here? This is used in particular. I know one example this is used is by our friends in Redmond for the Windows images. They want to make sure that the base layer isn't floating around. But someone figured out that what you're able to do is if you're able to control where that container D on your local server is downloading that image from, where that URL is for that layer, you're able to actually, if you're able to control that server and throw a HTTP 401, you're able to then say, you're basically saying, hey, it's unauthorized. You're not supposed to be doing that. The response from container D in this particular version was to go ahead and throw over your credentials. And what really caught my eye about this in the write-up was, and I quote, in some cases, this may be the user's username and password for the registry. In other cases, this may be credentials attached to the cloud virtual instance, which can grant access to other cloud resources in that account. That's the part I wanted to go and figure out what exactly is going on there. So if your container D for any reason has credentials for the rest of your cloud environment, that sounds all sorts of crazy balls, right? So the issue itself is bad. It's interesting, but it's basically tricking someone to sending your credentials over. But depending on what those credentials are, this could be make someone a very unhappy camper.
Yeah, definitely. That was an area that highlighted for me the idea of the two things. One, just what are the credentials you're using? Are you running, to be a little bit facetious, are you running as root, or that metaphorical equivalent for your cloud services? And it also kind of wanted me to go on a small soapbox, too, about just authentication schemes and mechanisms and the idea of what can we do better about a challenge response. And that's where I love going back to the idea of WebAuthM so we could have actual cryptographic anchors to figure out, should I, here's a cryptographically signed assertion of the domain I'm about to visit. And should I send my credentials to this domain or not? So I think there's some really cool ways that the future of authentication could improve. But clearly we're not there yet if we're just saying, hey, 401, please give me your creds. And those creds are getting sent across. So still plenty of work.
That, at least to me, when I first think about it, sounds like basic auth, yeah? I guess it wouldn't have to be. But
wouldn't have to be, but yeah, that's pretty much a basic auth, yeah. Maybe
so I wanted to... Before we keep going, I want to throw in one more thing on this to our listeners. The last few episodes we've been throwing in these, we've been talking a lot about vulnerabilities. I'd love to get some feedback from folks. Do you want us to be talking about vulnerabilities, like what's actually out there and how do you deal with it? Or would you like us to be looking more at the tools or the DevSecOps side of things? So if anyone has any complaints or congratulations or something, we'd love some feedback around that.
That's true. And listeners, stick around because we do have some architecture discussions near the end here. But until then, we do have a couple more vulns to focus on. In this case, let's shift over to that hardware side of things because I'll start with the Bluetooth because, again, I do love that there is yet more vuln branding that can start with BL to riff on Bluetooth. So in this case, the BleedingTooth, with great October Halloween type of title. But again, this was just a zero-click RCE, as it's been described, for adjacent devices. And I think that, I don't know if there's too much to get into here in technical details, other than I do want to highlight, and I think I put it into the show notes. What was really nice here from the Google security researchers is that they also linked to the Git commit where this vulnerability was first introduced. So from a sort of educational aspect, if you want to either just learn what insecure and secure code looks like, you could look and see what changed but from the original commit to the one where the fix was applied. But as well, if you want to be testing your own SAST tools or your other type of application security testing tools, testing them on these types types of scenarios, saying here was a Bluetooth vulnerability. Can my tool find it? Can I, build that abstract syntax tree, grep for this type of pattern, look for it elsewhere? It'd be great if we could do a similar thing with IPv6. Obviously, in this case with the Microsoft, we don't have access to the source code, but here in the Bluetooth, we do. So that was sort of that educational aspect I wanted to highlight this one.
Yeah, I thought this was it's interesting because I usually think of the BlueZ stack. I don't think I've ever personally. I know next year is the year for Linux in a desktop, but for the last 20 years, where it hasn't been, I don't run Bluetooth as a client on Linux. I use it when I'm doing pen testing or researching. So it's interesting to see a utility suite, which I'm used to using to poke at other folks, suddenly having a weakness that people can poke at me with it. So I thought that was interesting.
It was interesting, and this one at least does look like it can be a software update for the kernel or the kernel module, if I'm remembering correctly. So this is one of those Bluetooth vulns that actually looks like it will be able to be patched and relatively quickly, rather than relying on something that's a read-only ROM that basically you have to wait till the hardware goes away, which is much like this T2 research that was in the news this last week by a team from called T8012. They named themselves after this basically this little system on a chip inside recent, I want to say back to 2014 or 2016 MacBooks, that basically is the chip that runs that the touch bar, essentially. And in this case, they found a way to put the device into device firmware update, and then basically hook into this chip and muck about with it. Now, a couple things. One is from a threat modeling perspective, and that's, I think, whereas for me, the way that I was approaching this particular vulnerability is that you do need physical access to the laptop, to the device, and it doesn't immediately enable you to get to decrypt the file vault. So if you have your laptop, you have file vault enabled, you're still pretty good. What the researchers point out here, though, is that there's still good potential for it to brute force the passphrase that's used to protect that. So this is a good aspect, and I do have a couple other notes in here that are just some really good descriptions and educational blogs, just the thought process behind the research that went into attacking this secure ROM into this T2 chip. And what was the other thing I was thinking about there too? I forgot my notes. While I look at that, Matt or John, what do you think about this?
I can talk while you gather that thought there. So, and I think we talked about this recently, possibly with some of the Intel stuff. So one of the things here, when you bake your firmware in, I think I was talking about an IoT thing, but when you bake your firmware in to the degree that to reflash that device, to put that in air quotes for people on the podcast, if you basically sort of cut off the I don't know, I'm losing my analogies myself, but if you put yourself in that place where you can't reflash it, you got to be very, very careful, and it's super difficult to do. I'm not saying this is an easy thing to screw up, but so basically everything I've seen about this over the last week or so now, you ain't fixing your existing Mac, whether that's a Mac Mini or an MVP or what have you. So one of the things I'm curious about right now is, will we have a T3 for the ARM Macs coming out in the next few months, or how are they going to deal with this?
Yeah, that's a great question, because clearly we'll get a T3 all the way. If I forget my Terminator movies, all the T1000. But I think the other thing the other aspect I want to bring this up here as well is that here is this type of chip, this type of capability is one of the root anchors for the secure boot process. So as we start to talk about cloud services, or even just our handheld devices, call them your iPhones, your Androids, a lot of them have these anchors to these secure chips. So in this case, for example, a T2 would be responsible for approving kernel extensions as the operating system is loading. So if you can basically bypass the signing, or if you can get in your own malicious kernel extension, that's a lot of ownership you have over this system now. So it's one of those things to understand in your threat modeling. And when we're getting into these type of perimeterless architectures, zero trust architectures, where it's the device is trying to attest, yes, I have a high degree of confidence that I've booted up securely with the operating system and the software that I was expected to, and then here is the identity of my end user. If we start to erode some of the confidence in there, we have to worry a little bit about what other mitigating controls can we have in place for this.
Yeah, people might not. They might not be able to crack the encrypted file system with this, but if you're able to put a keylogger in, you've pretty much got it, right? So,
yeah, it's interesting because I got the new MacBook Pro and I'm fighting with my USB-C cables, and here this part of that cable was one of the ways to exploit this vulnerability. So I'm sitting there going, I wonder if that was actually an Apple cable I plugged into my Thunderbolt displays the other day.
yeah.
Yep, and that's what's fun. So speaking of chips are everywhere because that USB-C cable may even have its own chip in it. And as Matt is being not overly paranoid, a little bit justified in, what can that cable do to his system? And that's where I also wanted to pull in some research from NCC Group that was doing some basically old school voltage glitching against a MediaTek chip itself. And this was interesting to me. Once again, it's a great write-up. So if you want to learn a little bit more about some of the concepts and tooling around hardware testing, great write-up. And in this case too, as I mentioned, it's voltage glitching. So in the case that we were just talking about with the T2 chip, that's playing around with some of the playing around with the signing, playing around with what the flaws within the firmware. So code that's been miswritten. In this case, this is actually how the hardware itself is resilient against voltage spikes. And they were demonstrating that this particular chip wasn't resilient enough, and therefore it could be basically glitched, to use the term of art, into bypassing the secure BootROM process. So again, this isn't these capabilities or these types of attacks are going to be relatively. The attacks themselves are pervasive and possible against these hardware, against these chips, whether they're successful or not. That's the more important thing. And we haven't seen them being, overly successful. But once they are, this is the problem with, can you upgrade it or not? Can you flash that firmware? Or is it honestly intentionally read-only?
Yeah, this looks like fun. So it is, as you said, old school, our older school, the voltage glitching, but it's been on sort of a comeback this year. It's one of the sort of the sexy, trendy things for hardware hackers to be doing. I haven't done any of it. It's something I'd love to do. So I'm going to have to give this particular post a pretty close look and see if I can find some time.
It's been 30 plus years since I've had fields. So it's way past my skill set these days.
Come on, let's go play with the oscilloscope.
Yeah, right. Exactly. We used to in fields class back in the late 80s.
Always good to dust off the electrical engineering side of things. Mm-hmm. One other quick comment here. We've been talking about authentication, just perimeter list, and John, you had mentioned the QRadar. I think the SIM category of vulnerability. There was also just another vulnerability in a SonicWall VPN device. And again, here, this wasn't so much to dive into what the particular vulnerability was, but in the idea of how many of our security tools are growing our attack surface. And I think, too, one of the things that we could possibly talk about maybe more in depth in one of the future segments is about that idea of zero trust and how much do we need a classic VPN versus let's just have everything over HTTPS. And that's possibly giving us the type of attestation that we need in terms of who's the user identity that's visiting us and are we cryptographically secure from intermediation or eavesdropping attacks?
Yeah, I think we're going to see, obviously VPN's been hot because of all the remote workers. But, my point is, when do we move away from the VPN? To your point, Mike, is if we were doing everything as HTTPS, do we really need a VPN at that point? Do we need this single concentrator kind of bottleneck to connect all of our users, or can we connect securely in a distributed way? That's where Paul and I like to joke about the new SASE market from Gartner, right? That kind of secure edge environment. But I think we will move there. I think what we're seeing right now with the pandemic is going to force us to move into some of those directions anyways.
Yes, and what we've also seen with the pandemic is a lot of people using video chat quite a bit, and Zoom, of course, is one of the ones that we've talked about on the show for a couple times because it was notoriously around March, April, a little bit earlier this month in the news for a lot of application security flaws that they were dealing with. But in this case, in the spirit of not just focusing on flaws, but also focusing on let's build something secure, they've introduced end-to-end encryption, which I think is pretty good. And so in the show notes, we have linked to the white paper that they published when they first announced this is what our end-to-end encryption is going to look like. Here's our model, as well as importantly, here's some of the trade-offs you get, because encryption doesn't come for free when you're talking about monitoring or anti-abuse or things like that. And so this is some pretty interesting aspects to think about. And so there's both the Zoom specifically we could focus on, as well as I pulled in a Signal app. So again, from Whisper Systems, they published the protocol as well as the implementation in C, as well as some reference implementations in Rust and Swift for their libsignal protocol. And that's of interest to me too, and hopefully of interest to listeners, if they want to look at not only the idea of what does it take to roll your own crypto? Not that I'm saying do that yourself, design a protocol, but look at how a protocol has been designed and adopt it, because you can see what, in this case, how Zoom approached this, as well as what Whisper Systems approached from libsignal. How do they figure out the key distribution? How do they figure out who should be trusted parties? How do they figure out what if somebody is just monitoring all of the encrypted communications for all time, and then eventually later on they get a decryption key? Do we have forward secrecy or not? So there's a lot of interesting aspects here that I think are really neat to dive into.
Neat.
I think.
And the other thing I will point.
It's encryption. It's way over my head.
Sorry, Matt. Yeah, we saved it for the end so you could log off early. But one of the things I will. Go ahead, John.
I think what's actually interesting around here, this is super cool that they did this. And everything you're talking about, the stuff in Signal, a lot of us use it. We depend upon it for a lot of stuff we're doing. Don't want to go into politics, but we've got, I believe it's the Five Eyes or Seven Eyes. The various governments, large governments around the world are again attempting to try and crack encryption, to try and be able to get their fingers into this and see what people are talking about, which I understand the value of. But something for people to keep on their mind whether they're for or against that. And then my two thoughts on that and all of this stuff is it's pretty hard to make math illegal. So I'm happy guys are doing this. I want to see more of it. I'm happy that they're actually picking it's like I said before when we talked about encryption. It's my eyes roll into the back of my head, but that's because I want to do what they did here, which is use an open source reference protocol. So kudos to them for doing that as well.
Kudos to them, and hopefully, rather than just focusing on the mathy and cryptiness of it to make up words, also that's why I did want to bring in that idea of the threat modeling and abuse scenarios, because it was back in July, Mozilla was saying Firefox Send is going to have to be on pause, and then back in September they said it's now on official stopped, it's gone, and that was because so Firefox Send, if you're not familiar with it, was basically essentially a point-to-point encryption for sending securely email or data between two people. But it was being abused to deliver malware. And so, of course, if you have an end-to-end encrypted system and you aren't able to do something as simple as scan for viruses, scan for malware, do content inspection for abuse material, whether it's photos, whether it's just text, things like that. So there are particular trade-offs here, in addition to the points that John was making about Five Eyes. And there's also a document that I linked to from how WhatsApp implemented their signal protocol, and some of also some of the things that they considered in terms of these abuse scenarios. So that's what I think is really interesting, is that we can still have, from a product security perspective, how are we going to use encryption, as well as what does it mean when we introduce encryption, and do we lose some particular capabilities that are in fact useful and protective for our developers, or for our end users, and what are the trade-offs going to be? So those are rich conversations to have, I think, rather than just yep, AES, this particular mode, here's our ratcheting protocol and forward secrecy and all the things that can make poor Matt eyes roll.
And also, on this, I think you just said something really interesting there around the operational aspects of this. Okay, you want to do end-to-end encryption, cool. If you're that software vendor, either you're an IT shop that's trying to see what your users are doing from a DLP point of view, or you are a vendor that's writing something that wants to use end-to-end encryption. How do you do troubleshooting of that? So where is that encryption termination endpoint? Do you really encrypt straight all the way through to disk or memory or what have you, or do you have somewhere there where you have some sort of tap that allows you to do things? And most people will say the answer is don't put a tap in, but some folks will want to troubleshoot at some point. So there's lots of things to think about around this.
Lots of things to think about. And so that's your homework, everyone who's listening or hanging out with on the Discord. Let us know, would you like to see a lot more focus on these types of phones? Bring in some more tools, because actually we haven't talked about tools in quite a while. In addition to talking about architecture and secure designs, like we're talking about here with end-to-end encryption, or the cache that we were talking about, cache designs that we were talking about last week in Google's Chrome. So let us know, send us some feedback, as well as go watch some horror movies, because I want to say, I messed up my segue there. So we're doing this live, so no one knows how we're going to fix this and recover, other than I want to say thank you to Matt, thank you to John for joining me, thank you to everyone listening and joining us. We're going to see you next week on Application Scarecurity Weekly.